Park it close. I won't be long. Gregory Ashton didn't look up as the key fob left his fingers. He tossed it in a shallow, careless arc across the polished marble of the Ashton Global Holdings lobby, the way a man tosses a coin into a fountain, without thought, without expectation, without checking who was going to catch it. The keys sailed through the air, caught the light from the two-story chandelier overhead, and were caught in mid-flight by a hand belonging to a man who had not been standing there 5 seconds earlier to receive them. Marcus Reeves closed his fingers around the Merced's key fob out of pure reflex. He was 38 years old. He was wearing a hand-tailored three-piece suit in deep burgundy, a silk pocket square folded to a soft peak, and Italian leather shoes that had cost him the better part of $2,000. He was carrying a leather portfolio under his left arm. He had walked into the lobby of Ashton Global Holdings exactly 90 seconds earlier for a 9 o'clock meeting. He had not been standing near the valet stand. There was no valet stand. He looked at the key fob in his palm. Then he looked up at the man who had thrown it. Gregory Ashton had already turned away. He was scrolling through emails on a phone in one hand while a leather briefcase swung from the other. He was moving toward the elevator bank with the untroubled forward momentum of a man who had never in his 61 years on Earth had to look back to see whether the world had done what he told it to do. The receptionist behind the front desk, a young woman named Emily Chen, had gone very still. Her mouth was open. Her hand was frozen halfway between her keyboard and the phone. She had seen the whole thing. She had seen who Marcus was. She had, in fact, been the one who greeted him 90 seconds earlier by name and told him the executive team would be down to collect him shortly. 2 of the security officers standing near the reception desk had also seen it. One of them, a black man in his 50s named Officer Reynolds, had gone equally still. He was looking at Marcus with an expression that Marcus recognized. The expression of a man who has watched a thing happen he has watched happen many times before, and who is right now calculating how much of himself he is allowed to spend on the response. Across the lobby, 3 junior executives who had been waiting near the elevators for their own morning meetings had stopped talking. One of them, a young man in a charcoal suit, had actually taken a small step backward without realizing he was doing it, the way a person steps back from a chemical spill. Marcus stood in the center of the marble floor holding the key fob. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply held the keys and let the silence do its work. It was the silence of a lobby that had, in the space of about 4 seconds, understood collectively that something had just gone very wrong and that nobody in the room was yet certain how wrong it was going to get. Gregory Ashton pressed the call button for the elevator. He did not turn around. When he spoke again, it was over his shoulder, still without looking. Silver Mercedes, reserved spot on level 2. If it's not there when I come down at 11, I want to know why. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. Ashton stepped inside. He glanced up just long enough to press the button for the executive floor. In the fractional second between the doors sliding shut and the car beginning to rise, he finally looked across the lobby. His eyes swept past Marcus without stopping. They did not register a client. They did not register a man in a burgundy suit worth more than most of the cars in the parking garage. They registered, in the shorthand his brain had been running on for 6 decades, a person who had been given an instruction and could be trusted to carry it out because there was no other reason for a black man in his lobby to exist. The doors closed. Marcus stood alone in the middle of the lobby with the keys in his hand. He did not throw them. He did not raise his voice. He did not walk to the front desk and demand to see a supervisor. He simply looked down at the key fob for a long moment, the Mercedes logo pressed cleanly into the leather tag beside it, the numbers of a reserved parking spot printed in small block letters on the back. Then he looked up. He walked 6 steps to a low glass table beside one of the leather waiting chairs, and he set the key fob down on the table with a small, careful, deliberate click. He sat down in the chair next to it. He crossed one leg over the other. He opened his portfolio. And he waited. He had been early for the meeting. He was still early. To understand what was about to happen inside the executive suite of Ashton Global Holdings that morning, you need to back up about 11 months. You need to understand who Marcus Reeves actually was, not the version Gregory Ashton had constructed in the 4 seconds it took to throw a set of keys across a lobby. The real one. Marcus was born in a neighborhood on the west side of Baltimore, where the row houses leaned into each other like tired old men, and where the sound of sirens at 3 in the morning was as ordinary as the sound of rain. His mother, Lorraine Reeves, worked 2 jobs. She cleaned offices in the downtown financial district from 6 in the evening until midnight, and she worked the register at a pharmacy from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. In between, she slept in short bursts, and she raised 2 boys with a discipline that was equal parts love and calculation. His father was not in the picture. That was not a story Marcus told strangers. It was not a story he told most friends. What he did tell people when it came up was that his mother had done the work of 2 parents on the salary of half of one, and that whatever he had become, she had built the foundation for it with her own hands. Lorraine had one rule about school. It was not negotiable. It did not care about how Marcus felt on a given morning. It did not care whether he was tired or hungry or bored. The rule was that he would come home with A's or he would come home and try again the next day. She did not shout it. She did not threaten. She simply said it once when he was 7 years old, and she never had to say it again. Marcus made the honor roll every semester of middle school. He graduated valedictorian from a public high school where fewer than 40% of the students graduated at all. He earned a full academic scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania. He studied finance and economics with a minor in mathematics. He graduated summa cum laude. He was recruited by a top-tier investment bank in New York before he had walked across the stage to accept his diploma. He spent 6 years on Wall Street. He was good at it. He was, in fact, exceptional at it. He made Analyst of the Year in his 2nd year. He was promoted to Associate in his 3rd. He was on the fast track to Vice President when he did something none of his colleagues understood at the time. He resigned. He walked away from a 7-figure annual compensation package. He moved back to Baltimore, and he started a firm. The firm was called Reeves Capital Partners. Its stated mission was to provide institutional-grade investment management to family offices, foundations, and mid-sized endowments that had historically been overlooked or underserved by the large Wall Street houses. Its unstated mission was something Marcus had decided on the day he watched his mother count out coins on the kitchen counter to make rent, which was that he was going to build something that could not be taken away from him by anyone. The firm launched with 3 clients and $140 million under management. That was 7 years ago. Today, Reeves Capital Partners managed just over $2.4 billion across 47 institutional clients. Marcus had been named to Forbes 40 under 40 list twice. He had been the subject of a case study taught at his own alma mater. He had turned down 2 acquisition offers from firms twice his size, because the terms would have required him to relocate his headquarters out of Baltimore, and he had made a promise to his mother, who was still alive and still living 3 blocks from the row house where he had grown up, that he was not going to move his business out of the city that had raised him. But here is the part that mattered for what was about to happen in the lobby of Ashton Global Holdings that morning. Reeves Capital Partners had, over the last 3 years, quietly become one of the most sought-after mid-market asset managers on the East Coast. The firm's risk-adjusted returns had outperformed the S&P 500 for 9 consecutive quarters. 2 months earlier, a boutique advisory group representing the Ashton Family Trust had reached out to Marcus with a proposal. The proposal was straightforward. The Ashton family, through their holding company, was preparing to consolidate a portion of their diversified assets under a single institutional manager. The initial allocation would be $75 million. If the relationship performed to expectations over the first 24 months, the allocation would scale to a projected $200 million by year 3. Gregory Ashton did not handle the family's investment relationships personally. That was what he had a chief investment officer for. But the $75 million allocation had been flagged as a decision that required principal-level sign-off, which meant that Marcus was scheduled for a 9 o'clock meeting on the executive floor with Ashton himself, his CIO, and two members of the Family Trust's advisory board. The meeting was scheduled for exactly 78 minutes from the moment Gregory Ashton tossed his car keys across the lobby. The lobby settled into a strange, unnatural stillness. Marcus sat in the leather chair with his portfolio open on his lap, though he was not reading it. He was watching. He had been watching since the moment he sat down. The receptionist, Emily Chen, had picked up her phone and set it back down twice in the last 90 seconds without dialing. Officer Reynolds had shifted his weight from one foot to the other 3 times, and each time his eyes had flicked toward Marcus, and each time they had flicked away again. The 3 junior executives who had been waiting near the elevators had gotten on the next car up without meeting anyone's eyes. Nobody had come over to the leather chair. Nobody had spoken to him. Nobody had asked whether he was all right or whether he needed anything or whether there had been some kind of misunderstanding they could help clear up. That was the part Marcus was filing away most carefully, not the toss. The toss was one man's failure. The silence that followed was the building's. At 8:52, the elevator on the far left of the bank chimed. The doors opened and a woman stepped out. She was in her mid-40s, dressed in a slate-gray suit that had been cut to make her look taller than she was. She carried a slim tablet under one arm and a coffee in the other. Her name was Diane Kowalski, and she was the executive assistant to the chief investment officer of Ashton Global Holdings. She had been sent down to the lobby to collect Marcus Reeves for the 9 o'clock meeting and escort him to the 27th floor. She walked toward the reception desk with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been doing this job for 18 years and who did not intend to be late for anything today. She did not look toward the leather chair. She stopped at Emily Chen's desk. "I'm here for Mr. Reeves. He should be waiting." Emily's mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. Her eyes flicked involuntarily past Diane's shoulder toward the leather chair by the glass table. Diane, who was a person who read rooms for a living, followed the flick. She turned. She saw Marcus. She saw the burgundy suit and the portfolio and the perfect stillness of a man who was very obviously not accustomed to being made to wait. She saw the Mercedes key fob sitting on the glass table beside him like a piece of evidence at a crime scene. She did not yet know what she was looking at. She only knew that whatever it was not what she had been sent down to collect. She walked over. Her heels clicked twice on the marble, then went quiet as she crossed onto the low pile of the rug beneath the seating area. "Mr. Reeves?" Marcus looked up. "Yes. I'm Diane Kowalski, Mr. Whitaker's assistant. I'm here to bring you up. I'm terribly sorry to have kept you waiting." Marcus closed his portfolio. He stood. He extended his hand. Diane shook it. Her handshake was firm and professional and gave nothing away. Marcus liked her already. He liked her the way he had liked Priya at the airline lounge in a story he did not know he was echoing, the way a person likes another person who is doing their job correctly in a building where the job is not being done correctly. "Thank you, Ms. Kowalski. I appreciate you coming down." "Of course, if you'll follow me." She turned toward the elevators. Marcus turned to follow her. He took 2 steps. Then he stopped. He turned back to the glass table. He picked up the key fob. He waited in his palm for a moment. Then he slipped it into the interior pocket of his suit jacket next to his pen. Diane, who had turned to see why he had stopped, watched him do this without comment. She did not ask about the keys. She did not need to. She had, in the last 40 seconds, worked out most of the shape of what had happened, and she was a person who understood that some questions were not hers to ask in a lobby. They walked to the elevator together. Diane pressed the call button. The doors opened almost immediately. They stepped inside. Diane pressed the button for the 27th floor. The doors closed. For the first 10 seconds of the ride, neither of them spoke. Diane was looking at the numbers on the panel. Marcus was looking at his own reflection in the polished brass of the elevator doors. He looked, he thought, exactly like a man who had come to a 9 o'clock meeting. At the 11th second, Diane cleared her throat softly. She did not turn her head. She spoke to the doors. "Mr. Reeves, I want you to know that whatever happened downstairs before I got there is not how this company operates. Or at least it's not how it's supposed to operate. Marcus did not turn his head either. He also spoke to the doors. Ms. Kowalski, I appreciate you saying that. But I would gently suggest that how a company operates and how it's supposed to operate are two different things. We're about to find out which one is real. The elevator climbed. 27 floors of quiet mechanical efficiency, moving two people who had just spoken to each other more honestly than either of them had planned to. Diane Kowalski did not respond to what Marcus had said. She did not need to. She had been at Ashton Global Holdings for 11 years. She had in that time developed a very clear and unsentimental understanding of what the company was and what it pretended to be. She was, in her own quiet way, part of the reason it had not gotten worse. She was not, and she knew she was not, enough by herself to make it better. The doors opened onto the 27th floor. The Ashton Global Executive Suite was designed to communicate wealth without appearing to try. The floors were a wide plank walnut that had been reclaimed from a decommissioned 19th-century textile mill in Rhode Island, a detail the firm mentioned to visitors precisely often enough to seem casual about it. The walls were paneled in the same wood to hip height, then plastered in a soft, warm white above. The art on the walls was not by artists most people would recognize. It was by artists that people who recognized the artists would recognize, which was a more expensive category. There were fresh white orchids in low ceramic bowls on every surface that could hold a bowl. Diane led Marcus down a long corridor. She walked half a step ahead of him, at the polite angle of a person who was leading without seeming to. She stopped outside a set of double doors made of a rich dark wood with brushed steel handles. She placed her hand on the left handle. She turned to Marcus. Mr. Whitaker and the advisory board members are already inside. Mr. Ashton is running about 2 minutes behind. Can I get you anything before we begin? Coffee, water, tea? Water would be fine, thank you. Sparkling or still? Still, please. She opened the door. The conference room was long and rectangular and lit by a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city and in the far distance the dark ribbon of the river. A conference table in the same walnut as the floors ran nearly the full length of the room. There were 12 high-backed leather chairs around it, though only 3 were occupied. At the head of the table, in the second chair on the left, sat David Whitaker. He was the chief investment officer of Ashton Global Holdings. He was 64 years old, silver-haired, with the trim build of a man who ran 6 miles every morning and had done so for 40 years. He had been a colleague of Gregory Ashton's father before he had ever worked for Gregory. He was, by every account Marcus had been able to gather in the run-up to this meeting, a decent man in a difficult job. He stood as Marcus entered. Across from Whitaker sat 2 members of the Family Trust Advisory Board. The first was Helen Ashton Voss, Gregory's younger sister, a woman in her late 50s with a face that was kind in a way that suggested she had worked at it. The second was a man named Arthur Pemberton, who was in his early 70s, silver-templed, and who was, Marcus knew from his research, one of the 3 trustees who actually controlled the family's philanthropic capital and was therefore one of the most consequential votes in the room. All 3 of them stood. Mr. Reeves, David Whitaker, it's a real pleasure to finally meet you in person. Whitaker crossed the room and extended his hand. His grip was firm. His eye contact was steady. He introduced Helen and Arthur. Helen smiled warmly. Arthur inclined his head with the small, precise nod of a man who did not spend his warmth on introductions. They took their seats. Diane returned with a bottle of still water and a heavy crystal glass. She placed both on a leather coaster in front of Marcus. She left the room and closed the doors behind her. Mr. Reeves, Whitaker began, I want to thank you for making the trip up this morning. We've spent quite a bit of time on your firm's materials over the last few weeks. The performance numbers are frankly remarkable, but we didn't ask you here to walk us through the numbers again. We asked you here because we wanted to meet the person behind them. Marcus inclined his head. He did not smile. He had not smiled since he had walked into the lobby, and he was not going to start smiling now. I appreciate that, Mr. Whitaker. I'm happy to be here. But before we begin, I'd like to raise one matter that I think has some bearing on the conversation we're about to have. Helen Ashton Voss's eyes moved slightly. Arthur Pemberton's did not. Whitaker leaned back in his chair. "Please." Marcus reached into the interior pocket of his suit jacket. He removed the Merced's key fob. He placed it on the walnut table in front of him with the same small, careful, deliberate click he had used in the lobby. The three people across from him looked at the keys. Then they looked at Marcus. Nobody spoke. Then, exactly on cue, the double doors behind Marcus opened, and Gregory Ashton walked into the room. Gregory Ashton walked into the conference room at the pace of a man who had never in his life been the last person to arrive at a meeting he cared about. He was still on his phone. He was still carrying his briefcase. He was, in fact, in the middle of finishing a text as he crossed the threshold, thumbing the last few characters with the practiced efficiency of someone who considered the 60 seconds between an elevator and a chair to be productive time. He did not look up until he was almost at his seat at the head of the table. When he did look up, his eyes went first to Whitaker, then to his sister Helen, then to Arthur Pemberton. Each of those three faces gave him a small piece of information that his brain did not know what to do with. Whitaker's expression was neutral in a way that was itself information. Helen's was pale. Arthur's was completely blank, which for Arthur was the equivalent of a raised eyebrow on any other man. Then his eyes moved to the fourth person at the table. He saw the burgundy suit. He saw the leather portfolio open on the walnut in front of the man. He saw the crystal glass of water on the leather coaster. He saw the way the man was sitting, easy but exact, one hand resting flat beside the portfolio, the other loose in his lap. He saw all of that in the fractional second it took his eyes to travel from Arthur Pemberton's face to Marcus Reeves's face. And then he saw the key fob. It was sitting on the walnut table halfway between them, the small brown leather tag with the numbers of a reserved parking spot on level 2 facing directly toward him. The Merced's emblem caught the light from the windows behind him. It was the only object on the table that was not either a leather coaster, a crystal glass, a bottle of water, or a portfolio. Gregory Ashton's forward momentum stopped. His right foot, which had been about to complete a step toward his chair, came down half an inch short of where it had been aimed. His phone was still in his left hand. The screen was still showing the text he had been finishing. His thumb was still hovering half an inch above the send button, but his thumb was not moving anymore. He looked at the key fob. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the key fob again. He did not, at first, understand. His brain, which had spent the last 3 minutes on the assumption that the meeting he was about to walk into was one of the routine principal-level sign-offs that made up the ordinary rhythm of his week, was now being asked to reconcile two pieces of information that did not fit. The first piece was that there was a black man at his conference table wearing a suit that Gregory himself could not have easily afforded on his personal side of the ledger. The second piece was that the keys he had thrown across his lobby 9 minutes earlier were sitting 6 feet in front of him. For approximately 4 seconds, Gregory Ashton stood in the middle of his own conference room with his phone still in his hand and a text still unsent, and did what a man does when his internal map of the world stops corresponding to the world. David Whitaker cleared his throat. "Gregory, this is Marcus Reeves, founder and chief executive of Reeves Capital Partners. Mr. Reeves, this is Gregory Ashton, chairman of Ashton Global Holdings." Marcus stood. He extended his hand across the table. "Mr. Ashton." Gregory did not move for another full second. Then he did what 37 years of executive muscle memory told him to do. He set his briefcase down on the floor. He pocketed his phone without looking at the screen. He took 2 steps to the head of the table. He extended his own hand across the walnut. "Mr. Reeves, please, forgive me, I was, He did not finish the sentence. There was, in fact, no ending to that sentence that he was going to be able to say out loud in front of David Whitaker, his sister, and Arthur Pemberton. Marcus shook his hand once. The grip was polite and brief. Marcus sat back down. Gregory remained standing for another moment. His eyes went once more to the key fob on the table, then to Marcus, then to the empty chair at the head of the table. He sat down in it with the slow, careful motion of a man lowering himself into a bath that might turn out to be much colder than he had been told. Helen Ashton Voss folded her hands on the table in front of her. Arthur Pemberton had not moved a muscle since Gregory had walked in, and did not move one now. Whitaker looked at Marcus, and with the small courtesy of a chair passing the floor, opened one palm slightly in his direction. Marcus reached forward. He picked up the key fob. He turned it over once in his hand so that the numbers of the reserved parking spot were now facing up, clearly visible to Gregory. He set the fob back down on the table, closer to Gregory than to himself, in the neutral space between them. He spoke very quietly. "I believe these are yours, Mr. Ashton. You gave them to me in the lobby 9 minutes ago and asked me to park your car." The silence in the conference room was the kind that had weight. It pressed against the walnut paneling, and the reclaimed floorboards and the tall windows, and the low ceramic bowls of white orchids. It pressed against David Whitaker, who had not taken his eyes off Gregory Ashton since Marcus had finished speaking. It pressed against Helen Ashton Voss, who was looking down at her folded hands with the expression of a woman who had known her older brother for 58 years and who had not, until this exact moment, allowed herself to fully understand what she had known. It pressed hardest against Gregory himself. The color that had been on his face when he sat down was leaving now. It was leaving from the top down. His forehead went first, then his cheeks. Then the small tight place at the corner of his jaw where a muscle had begun to work involuntarily. His mouth had opened slightly. It was not shaping any words. It was simply open, the way a mouth is open when the person behind it is trying to breathe against something that has just pressed the air out of their chest. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Marcus did not fill the silence. He had learned, over many years of sitting across tables from men like Gregory Ashton, that the most powerful thing a person could do in a moment like this one was to leave the silence exactly where it was. Let it sit. Let it find its own weight. Let it settle into the room and let the man on the other side of the table find out what it felt like to breathe in it. Gregory finally spoke. His voice was not the voice he had used in the lobby. It was thinner. It came from higher in his throat. "Mr. Reeves, that was." He stopped. He tried again. "There has been a very serious misunderstanding." Marcus tilted his head very slightly. It was not a nod. It was the small measured motion of a man who was going to hear the sentence out before he responded to it. "Please go on, Mr. Ashton." Gregory swallowed. He looked for a fraction of a second at Whitaker. Whitaker did not look back. Whitaker was looking with a kind of fixed and terrible patience at the table. Gregory looked at his sister. Helen did not look up. Gregory looked, finally, and with the desperation of a man reaching for the last available handhold, at Arthur Pemberton. Arthur Pemberton met his eyes with an expression so completely neutral that it was, in its own way, more devastating than any expression of anger could have been. It was the expression of a man who was, in real time, revising a calculation he had been running for 40 years about how much Gregory Ashton could be trusted with the capital that Arthur Pemberton controlled. Gregory looked back at Marcus. "I did not know." Marcus let that sentence sit in the room for a moment. Then he spoke, very quietly, and with the calm precision of a man who had been thinking about what he was going to say for the last 11 minutes. "Mr. Ashton, I appreciate you saying that, but I would like to make sure we understand each other clearly, because there is a decision on the table this morning that involves $75 million, and I don't think either of us should make that decision while we are still confused about what happened." Gregory's mouth closed. He nodded once, a small stiff nod. "You did not know that I was Marcus Reeves. That is true. You did not know that I was the person your CIO and your family's advisory board were about to spend the next 90 minutes discussing a 9-figure allocation with. That is also true. But the reason you did not know those things is not because I was hiding them. I walked into your lobby wearing a suit that costs more than most of the cars in your garage. I was carrying a portfolio. I had checked in with your receptionist by name. I was, by every visible indicator, a man who had a 9 o'clock appointment on your executive floor. You did not see any of that. You did not see it because you did not look. You did not look because when you walked into that lobby, Your brain had already sorted every person in the room into one of two categories, and I was in the wrong one. Gregory Ashton's face had gone from pale to something worse than pale. It had gone gray. "Mr. Reeves, I'm not finished." The two words came out at exactly the same volume as everything else Marcus had said. They were not raised, they were not sharpened, but they landed in the room with the finality of a heavy book being set down on a table. Gregory Ashton's mouth closed. "I want to be very clear with you about something, because I think it is going to be important for the rest of this conversation. I am not upset because you were rude. I have been in enough boardrooms in my career to know that rich men are rude to people all the time, and that most of the time it does not mean anything beyond the fact that they were raised without the manners to know better. I am upset because of what your rudeness required you to assume about me before you had ever seen my face." Gregory Ashton did not speak. He had, over the course of the last 90 seconds, arrived at the understanding that anything he said in the next several minutes was going to make things worse rather than better, and that his best available move was to sit very still and let the man across the table finish what he had come to say. It was not an understanding that came easily to him. He was, by nature and by 37 years of professional habit, a man who spoke first and adjusted later. But there was something in the room now that was larger than his habits, and he had the survival instinct at least to recognize it. Marcus continued. His voice had not changed. It was still calm. It was still exact. "You did not throw those keys to me because I looked like a valet. There is no valet in your lobby. There has never been a valet in your lobby. Your building does not have a valet service. Your car is parked by you or by your driver or occasionally by a member of your security team when you're running late. You knew that when you walked in this morning, which means you did not confuse me for a valet. You did not confuse me for anyone. You looked at me and your brain produced an instruction, and the instruction was to hand off the keys to the nearest black man in the room. That is what happened, Mr. Ashton. That is the thing we are actually talking about." Helen Ashton Voss made a small sound. It was not a word. It was the small, involuntary sound a person makes when they have just watched someone they love be described accurately by a stranger and have realized that the description matches. Gregory did not turn his head to look at his sister. He kept his eyes on Marcus. There was in his face now a new expression that had not been there before. It was not defensiveness. It was not anger. It was the expression of a man who was, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, being described to himself in language he could not immediately dismiss. Marcus reached for the crystal glass of water. He took a small, measured sip. He set it back down on the leather coaster. He did not look away from Gregory as he did it. "I am going to tell you what is going to happen next, Mr. Ashton, and I am going to tell you plainly, because I think plainly is the only register left available to us this morning. I came to this meeting prepared to accept a $75 million allocation from your family trust. My firm has, as your CIO can confirm, the operational capacity to manage that capital responsibly, and the track record to justify the confidence. I was, before I walked into your lobby 40 minutes ago, entirely prepared to build a working relationship with this institution that I expected would grow, over time, into something considerably larger than $75 million. He paused. He let the past tense of the sentence sit in the room for a moment. "I am no longer prepared to do that." Whitaker's head came up very slightly. Helen looked up for the first time since Gregory had sat down. Arthur Pemberton, whose face had been carefully neutral for the entire exchange, allowed the smallest possible tightening at the corners of his eyes. It was not a reaction to what Marcus had said. It was a reaction to what Marcus had said in front of the three other people at the table. Gregory Ashton's hands, which had been resting flat on the walnut in front of him, closed slowly into loose fists and then opened again. "Mr. Reeves, I understand that you are upset. I would like to propose that we table this conversation for an hour. I will personally apologize, in whatever form you feel is appropriate. I will make whatever accommodation you and my CIO agree is necessary to restore your confidence. This does not have to end our business relationship before it has begun." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Ashton, I want you to understand something about the sentence you just spoke, because I think you did not hear it the way it sounded. You proposed that we table the conversation about how you treated a black man in your lobby for an hour so that we could preserve the business conversation that is worth $75 million to your family, and presumably, some amount of career preservation to you. What you have just told me without meaning to is that the money is the part you consider real and the treatment of the man is the part you consider negotiable. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I have sat with that particular arrangement my entire professional life. It is not new to me. What is new is that I am now, for the first time in my career, on the side of the table where I get to say no to it. The silence returned. It was heavier now. It had accumulated. Whitaker was watching Marcus with an expression that was very difficult to read. Helen was crying quietly. She was not making any sound. There were simply two thin lines of water running down her cheeks that she was making no effort to wipe away. Arthur Pemberton had not moved. His hands were folded exactly as they had been folded when Marcus had first sat down. Gregory Ashton lowered his eyes to the table. For a long moment, nobody at the walnut table moved. Gregory Ashton was still looking down. His eyes were fixed on the small brown leather tag of the key fob, though he did not appear to be reading the numbers on it. He was looking at it the way a man looks at something that has fallen out of his hand and shattered, aware that he had been holding it a moment ago and unable now to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to it being on the floor. Arthur Pemberton was the one who finally broke the silence. He did it by clearing his throat once very quietly. It was the smallest possible sound, but every head in the room turned toward him because every head in the room understood, in the way that people who work in and around wealth understand these things, that Arthur Pemberton did not speak in meetings unless what he was about to say was worth listening to. "Mr. Reeves, may I ask you a question?" Marcus turned to him. "Of course. I have known the Ashton family for 41 years. I served alongside Gregory's father on the trust for the last 19 years of his life. I have been a trustee of this family's philanthropic capital for the 22 years since. I mention this only so that you understand that whatever I am about to say is being said by someone who has been in the room for a great deal of the history that has produced this morning. Do I have your permission to speak candidly?" "You do." Arthur Pemberton turned his head slightly. He looked at Gregory Ashton. He looked at him for what felt to everyone else in the room like a long time. Then he turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Reeves, I am not going to ask you to reconsider your decision. That would be, in my judgment, both futile and inappropriate. I would like instead to ask you a different question. If the $75 million allocation that was on the table this morning were, for reasons entirely unrelated to your firm, to be redirected from the Ashton family's operating trust to the Ashton family's philanthropic foundation, and if that foundation were, in the ordinary course of its independent trustee governance, to select an outside manager for a significant portion of its endowment, would Reeves Capital Partners consider such a mandate?" The room went very still. David Whitaker, who had spent 40 years learning to read the intentions of men like Arthur Pemberton, understood immediately what had just happened. He allowed himself the very small permission of leaning back 1 degree further into his chair. Marcus Reeves, who was smart enough to understand what had just happened but experienced enough not to react to it, allowed a beat to pass before he answered. "Mr. Pemberton, my firm would consider any mandate on its merits. The identity of the client matters less than the alignment of the mission. If the Foundation's investment committee were to reach out to my office through the ordinary channels, I would give the conversation the same serious consideration I give every institutional inquiry." "Thank you, Mr. Reeves. That is all I needed to hear." He turned back to Gregory. He did not speak. He did not need to. Gregory understood, without a word being said, that his sister's philanthropic foundation was about to become an entirely different conversation than the one they had all been having 10 minutes ago, and that the $75 million that had just walked out of his operating trust was going to walk into a room where he did not have a vote. Helen Ashton Voss lifted her head. She had stopped crying. She wiped her cheeks once, unhurriedly, with the back of her hand. "Arthur," I would like that conversation to happen this week. I anticipated that you would. She turned to Marcus. Her voice was steady. Mr. Reeves, I am not going to apologize to you for my brother because my brother is a grown man and his apologies are his to make or fail to make. I would like to apologize instead for myself. I have known the person my brother is capable of being for a very long time. I have made my peace with it in ways I now understand were not mine to make peace with. I am sorry that my accommodation of him over many years has been part of the reason he walked into a lobby this morning and felt entitled to do what he did. I am going to think about that, and I am going to do something about it. I do not expect you to forgive me for any of it. I am only telling you because I want you to know that some of the people at this table heard what you said. Marcus inclined his head. It was the same small measured motion he had used earlier. This time, there was something warmer inside it, something that Helen would notice and hold onto later. Ms. Ashton Voss, thank you. Gregory Ashton had not looked up from the key fob. Marcus turned to David Whittaker. Mr. Whittaker, I have taken enough of your morning. I want to thank you for the professionalism you and your team have extended to me during this process. Whatever happens next between our firms, I hope you know that I have deep respect for the way you personally have conducted yourself. Whittaker's mouth moved very slightly. It was not a smile. It was something more measured than a smile, but it was in the same family. Mr. Reeves, the respect is mutual and it is not incidental. Marcus closed his portfolio. He tucked it under his left arm. He stood. He did not stand quickly. He did not stand slowly. He stood at the exact pace of a man who had said what he had come into the room to say and who saw no reason to linger past the saying of it. He looked for the last time at Gregory Ashton. Mr. Ashton, I am going to leave the keys on the table. They are yours. What you do with the last 10 minutes of this morning and the 10,000 mornings after it is not going to be my concern. But I want to say one thing to you before I go, because I think it may be the only thing anyone in this room says to you today that has any chance of being useful to you later. Gregory Ashton looked up. He looked up because he could not, at this point, do otherwise. His eyes were wet at the corners, though whether from shame or from the plain physiological pressure of the last 12 minutes was not a question anyone in the room could have answered with certainty. You are 61 years old. You have been the person you were in that lobby for a very long time. I'm not going to stand here and pretend that a single morning is going to change that. It won't. What I want to tell you is that the world you were raised in, the world that taught you to walk into a room and see people the way you saw me, is not the world you are going to die in. That world is already dying. It is dying slowly in some places, and it is dying quickly in others, but it is dying everywhere. And the men who choose to die with it, the men who cannot let it go, are going to be remembered by their children and their grandchildren as small men who did not know how to grow. You still have time to be remembered as something else. I hope, for the sake of the people who love you, that you use it. He did not wait for a response. He turned. He walked the length of the walnut table. He crossed the reclaimed floorboards. He passed under the tall windows with their view of the river. He opened the double doors and he walked out. Diane Kowalski was standing in the corridor outside. She had not moved from the spot where she had left him. She had, in fact, been standing there for the entire 12 minutes, holding her tablet in front of her at exactly the angle a person holds a tablet when they are pretending to check their email and are actually listening through a door. She fell into step beside him. She walked him back down the corridor toward the elevator bank. She pressed the call button. The doors opened. They stepped inside. She pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. For the first 15 seconds of the ride down, neither of them spoke. Then Diane cleared her throat very softly. Mr. Reeves, Ms. Kowalski, I am going to be looking for a new position within the next 90 days. I do not know exactly what I am going to be looking for yet. I do know that I do not want to be looking for it in a building where what happened this morning is the kind of thing that happens. If your firm were ever, at any point in the future, to be considering an experienced executive assistant with 11 years of institutional experience and a very thorough understanding of what a functional workplace does and does not look like, I would appreciate the chance to be considered. Marcus did not turn his head. He watched the numbers descend on the panel. Ms. Kowalski, send your resume to my office this week. Address it to me personally. I will make sure it is read. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Thank you, Ms. Kowalski, for coming down to the lobby exactly the way you came down. The doors opened onto the lobby. Marcus stepped out. Diane did not follow him. She pressed a button on the panel to hold the doors, and she watched him cross the marble floor. The lobby was different now. Word had traveled in the way word travels in buildings like this, in silences and glances, and the small, stiff postures of people who have heard something they are pretending they have not heard. Emily Chen at the reception desk stood as Marcus approached. She did not sit back down. Officer Reynolds, the security officer who had watched the whole thing an hour earlier, was standing near the front doors now. He was standing in a spot that was very slightly out of his usual position, in a way that suggested he had moved there on purpose so that Marcus would pass him on his way out. Marcus stopped at the reception desk. Ms. Chen, Mr. Reeves, thank you for greeting me by name this morning. I noticed. It was the right thing and it was done correctly, and I want you to know that I noticed. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. He walked to the front doors. He stopped in front of Officer Reynolds. He extended his hand. Officer Reynolds shook it. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. Marcus walked out into the morning. The car that had brought Marcus to the meeting was waiting at the curb. His driver, a man named Anthony who had been with him for 4 years, opened the rear door without a word. Anthony had, in the way of drivers who spend enough time with the people they drive, developed a very reliable sense of when to ask questions and when not to. He did not ask any now. Marcus slid into the back seat. Anthony closed the door and walked around to the driver's side. The car pulled away from the curb and joined the flow of morning traffic. For the first 8 blocks, Marcus did not speak. He watched the city move past the tinted window. He was thinking about his mother. He was thinking about the row house 3 blocks from where she still lived. He was thinking about a small boy who had watched her count coins on a kitchen counter and had promised himself, without knowing what the promise would eventually cost or what it would eventually mean, that he was going to build something. At the 9th block, he took out his phone. He called his chief of staff, a woman named Vanessa Park who had been with him since the 2nd year of the firm. When she picked up, she did not say hello. She said, "How did it go?" "It went about the way we thought it might. I am going to give you the summary in the office, but I want 3 things to start now. First, I want a meeting scheduled with Arthur Pemberton's office by close of business today. He is a trustee of the Ashton Family Foundation. He knows what the meeting is about. He is expecting the call. Second, I want a resume from a woman named Diane Kowalski to be arriving at your inbox this week. When it does, I want it walked directly to me. I don't want it processed through the usual channels. Third, I want you to reach out to my mother's building and have flowers delivered to her by noon. White orchids, she'll know what they mean. Understood, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Vanessa. I have been fine for a long time. The question has never been about me." He ended the call. He set the phone down on the seat beside him. He looked out the window. The story of what happened in the lobby of Ashton Global Holdings that morning did not become a news story. It did not go viral. There was no video. There were no headlines. The world outside that building never learned Gregory Ashton's name in connection with what he had done, and it never learned Marcus Reeves's name in connection with what he had refused. What happened instead was quieter, and in the long run, larger. The Ashton Family Foundation, under the guidance of Helen Ashton Voss and Arthur Pemberton, awarded a mandate to Reeves Capital Partners 3 months later. The initial allocation was $120 million. It was, by any measure, considerably larger than the $75 million that had walked off the operating trust's table. Within 18 months, the mandate had grown to $240 million. Within 3 years, the foundation had become one of Reeves Capital Partners' anchor clients. David Whitaker retired from Ashton Global Holdings 6 months after the meeting. He did not give a reason publicly. Privately, to a small handful of people, he said only that he had reached an age at which he was no longer willing to spend the mornings of his life in the service of things he could not respect. He joined the advisory board of Reeves Capital Partners the following spring. He served on it without compensation for 7 years until his health required him to step back. Diane Kowalski's resume arrived at Marcus's office 11 days after the meeting. She was hired within the month. She was, by year 3, the chief of staff for the firm's institutional client group. By year 7, she was a partner. Gregory Ashton stayed on as chairman of Ashton Global Holdings for another 4 years. Whether he ever sat, in the quiet of his own house in the middle of his own night, with what Marcus had said to him about the world that was dying, was not a thing anyone outside that house would ever know. His sister Helen said once to a friend, many years later, that she thought her brother had spent the rest of his life trying to be a different man than the one who had walked into that lobby that morning, and that she thought he had partly succeeded and partly failed, in the way that most people who try to change late in life partly succeed and partly fail. She did not say more than that. It was not her story to tell. The Merced's key fob stayed on the walnut table of the conference room on the 27th floor for the rest of the day. No one moved it. It was still there when the cleaning crew came through that night. One of the cleaners, a woman who had worked in that building for 19 years and had heard, in the way that cleaners hear everything, some version of what had happened that morning, picked it up and placed it in the drawer of the credenza against the far wall. Nobody ever asked for it back. So here is what I want you to sit with, and I want your honest answer in the comments. Not about Marcus, not about Gregory or Helen or Arthur or the outcome, about the lobby. The moment before any of it was resolved, when a man in a burgundy suit was standing on marble holding a set of keys that had been thrown to him, and every person in that room saw it happen. What would you have done? If this story hits something real in you, share it, because the conversation it starts is the whole point. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.